First of all, Luke, thanks very much for having me. I've got a hell of a story to share, one that I still have a little bit of trouble believing is true, but the more I've learned about it, the more evidence there is that this is what happened. Essentially, I am a bit of a geek for London history, very, very fascinated by the City of London, the bit of probably the most powerful institution in the world that very, very few people know about, all the banking and so on, that was at the heart of the British Empire. And sort of around a particular architect, a guy called Nicholas Hawksmoor, there were a series of urban legends, urban myths. His name pops up in From Hell by Alan Moore, in a book called Hawksmoor by the amazing author Peter Ackroyd, and also a poet called Ian Sinclair wrote about Hawksmoor's churches. And he said if you map Hawksmoor's churches out, they make a pattern, and that pattern he called the shape of fear. So really, I was kind of fascinated by what people were saying about Hawksmoor, and the fact his churches seem to provoke quite a strong reaction in some very cool people. So the first thing I did was I put his churches on Google Earth. And as you can see, they do make a shape. This is what Ian Sinclair called the shape of fear. It's kind of obvious, let's say, that he was deliberately trying to make a shape because the distances between some of these churches are completely irregular, and he also set churches up so that they have particular lines of sight. He used like compulsory purchase powers to buy the land, and so the idea that he didn't have something in mind when he was doing this is really where what I started to question. People say this distribution of churches is random, but actually it's pretty easy to prove that they're not. My book is really me exploring what I think he was up to by putting the churches in those places in that order. Essentially, people say Hawksmoor's churches, the distribution of them is random, but if you go to the top of Greenwich Hill and look down over Greenwich Hospital that he and Wren built, in a direct line along the line of symmetry that the whole complex is built on, you follow that line of symmetry over the Isle of Dogs to the north, and about a mile and a bit away is the church he built, St Anne's Limehouse, which lines up directly with that line of symmetry. That's no longer visible because they built Canary Wharf on the Isle of Dogs, but for a couple of hundred years you'd have seen that Hawksmoor was exactly lining his churches up. There's no doubt that he was trying to do something with their placement on the map, if you like, their organisation. St Anne's Limehouse and the location of it proves that Hawksmoor was up to something with the location of his churches. And it was really by learning about Hawksmoor and what he was up to that I became aware of the work really of Sir Christopher Wren, who everyone sort of heard of. His work and he himself were really, really, really controversial. Christopher Wren was hated by a lot of people, especially the people who had fought on the parliamentary side of the Civil War. Christopher Wren's dad was actually in charge of the Order of the Garter, and the Order of the Garter was what Charles I had used to organise the Royalist army in the Civil War. So Christopher Wren's dad pretty much ran the intelligence side of the Royalist cause during the Civil War. So Christopher Wren's uncle was Bishop of Ely, in charge of Cambridge, and had persecuted lots of Protestant thinkers there. The Wren family were very, very, very deeply involved with the Stuart family, and for that reason, Christopher Wren was a very controversial figure. It's clear from what Hawksmoor said that Wren was very, very angry about the Great Fire of London. Hawksmoor was subject to all these kind of urban myths. There is something about the distribution of his churches, and when I was trying to find out about him, I came across this quote, which really, really struck with me, because this was written in the 1720s, so like a good 50 years after the Fire of London. And he says, London should have been rebuilt, a convenient, regular city, excellent, skillful, honest artificers made by the greatness and quantity of the work in rebuilding such a capital, but instead it's all gone to shit. I mean, literally, he's angry about the way London's being rebuilt, and that really didn't make much sense to me at the time. He was angry about the Great Fire of London, and I just couldn't understand why anyone was angry about the Great Fire of London. It didn't make any sense to me. Over time, it became clear that it wasn't Hawksmoor's opinion, this really, it was Christopher Wren. Christopher Wren was very, very angry about the Great Fire of London. One day in particular, in the aftermath of the fire, he thought he was going to be able to rebuild all of London on a grid pattern. And this pattern was something he obviously thought about a lot and got ready in very, very, very quick time. In less than a week, he had plans to rebuild all of London. That wasn't a coincidence. He'd spent the previous summer, 1665, in Paris, learning how to rebuild a town from the people who were doing it for Louis XIV. A guy called Jean-Baptiste Colbert was sort of Louis XIV's go-to guy for getting things done. And Wren spent time talking to the architects and even met the artist, the sculptor Bernini, when he was in Paris, learning in 1665 the basics of how to rebuild a city. So when he came back to London in 1666 and it all burnt down, he was ready with plans to rebuild all of London. So Wren was thwarted in this. It never happened. London wasn't rebuilt according to his master plan. His legacy, Wren's legacy, and how he passed on his responsibilities to Hawksmoor is really how I began to understand that maybe the Great Fire of London was not the accident we were all told it was when we go to school. It's pretty much the first thing every kid in Britain learns at school is about the Great Fire of London happening by accident because of a baker's shop burning down. Now, there are a couple of notes on here that are worth mentioning. Like this quote from Hawksmoor talks about skillful, honest artificers being made by the greatness of the work. In other words, because London had burnt down and it was all going to be rebuilt in stone, there was a great opportunity to recruit and train masons. And on the 1717, on the 21st of June, a pub called the Goose and Gridiron, that's where the Freemasonry that's best known today is what's called Scottish Rite Freemasonry began. It began in that pub. Hawksmoor was there with Wren, and that was the beginning of what's called Scottish Rite Freemasonry. Now, very interestingly, previous to this, there was another form of Freemasonry that existed in London, and that was associated with the Worshipful Company of Masons, the business, the guild that looked after building in stone in London. Now, when the fire happened, King Charles II said to the Worshipful Company of Masons, "You no longer have a monopoly. I'm going to get rid of your monopoly on rebuilding." And he gave all the work, instead of giving it to the traditional Worshipful Company of Masons, he gave all the work to Christopher Wren. Christopher Wren was using this as a recruitment tool for his Scottish Rite Freemasonry, and the previous the popular form of Freemasonry in London was squeezed out. That's now known as Irish Rite Freemasonry. It was more egalitarian in its outlook, and it's sort of Masons associated with Irish Rite Freemasonry who were behind the American Revolution and the French Revolution, for example, a much more radical bunch of people. The Scottish Rite Freemasonry that exists and dominates in England now is very, very, very monarchist and places the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem at the heart of their ritual. The Irish Rite Freemasons used to look back to Egypt and used to especially revere Euclid, the geometry guy. Two totally different belief systems. And as a result of the Great Fire of London, Christopher Wren and his friends were able to shoehorn in their version, their modern version of Freemasonry, which was called Scottish Rite, and involved total obedience to the king.
And then obviously that leads into where he ends up building these new churches, which was the point which brought you to this book in the first place.
Sure. What happened was the Wren street plan was not implemented. Christopher Wren was very, very angry about that. It was the 18th of September 1666. Charles II said, "Right, no one rebuild anything. We're going to build London. We're going to rebuild London on a grid plan. It's all going to be marvelous and wonderful. Nobody build anything." And then by the afternoon of the 18th of September, Charles II had changed his mind. He said, no, you can build as you were. And what had happened was a delegation from the City of London had gone from the city to Westminster and said to the king, "Look, if this town has just burnt down in mysterious circumstances, and now you're saying we can't rebuild our houses on our land, then you're a tyrant. We don't believe this was an accident, and we're going to rebel against you and do to you what we did to your father. I execute you. Charles II therefore changed his mind and said, no, all right, we're not going to rebuild on a grid system. We're not going to do any of that. And he vacated the City of London. That made Christopher Wren very, very angry. Now, Charles II, I guess, had the decision to make. Would he annoy all the bankers and all the richest people in the country, or one 5'2" tall architect? And so, Christopher Wren lost out, and he's very angry for the rest of his life. You can read anything Wren said about architecture and about Charles II. He was bitter that he didn't get to build this. So the idea that all of this was an accident doesn't fit with the historical facts.
Yeah, definitely not. So do you want to talk about the rebuilding of the churches now, or should we
thank you. The Wren plan was shelved, and London rebuilt on its original street plan. But in 1711, the Tory government at that time wanted to try and do something to impose some kind of godly order, you could say, on the godless, rebellious city of London. And so what they did was they created the 50 Churches Act of 1711. This is the act that meant Hawksmoor could build his churches. And the plan was to build 50 parish churches across London and pepper London with these very, very, very robustly built parish churches. Now, the parish church was the seat of local government. It's where, you had to go to church on Sunday. You had to pay your local taxes there. It was where the local police were organised, where, they'd organised the local jail. The local law and order was all run out of the parish church. So 50 of these parish churches would have been like putting 50, if you like, police stations. By putting these 50 churches in, they were trying to change the recipe of London, if you like. These were going to be very, very conservative Church of England, high Tory churches where people were expected to go every week and learn about their duty to be obedient to God and to the king.
Is it like your morality police kind of thing?
Very much so, yeah. And the idea was 50 of these churches would be enough to change the culture of London to make it more obedient. And this was the bill where under which Hawksmoor built his churches. They only ended up building 12 because the Tories got kicked out of government, and the Whigs wanted nothing to do with it. But this was still part of the ongoing Tory-Whig battle for control of the capital of England. London was a much more egalitarian place at the time. There was less lords, ladies, dukes, duchesses, the aristocratic hierarchy. It was more or less meritocratic. And it was London and Londoners that the Stuart family blamed the Civil War for. They thought that it was those people and that rebellious town that had caused the Civil War, and they were broadly correct. What they wanted to do was impose these 50 churches on London and impose morality police, impose conformity. So that was the point of the 50 Churches Act that Hawksmoor used, or Hawksmoor was commissioned by to build his churches. So he was very much a Tory, he was very much a royalist, and he wanted to use his churches to impose law, you could say law and order on London.
You talk about sort of like the way that they change the style for depending on the area in London. So is it where the poorer areas, they got like the horrible imposing church, and then obviously the rich areas get this beautiful
yes. So what a lot of people point out is that the churches Hawksmoor built were very, very, very different to one another. They're all built for the same purpose under the same act, but depending on where they were, he'd build a completely different church. The churches in the East End were very, very austere. And there's actually a little bit of architectural language that I learned, which is the columns represent the people. Now, in the East End churches, the columns are very plain to represent the very plain people of the East End. In the West End church, the columns are much more decorous. They're what's called Corinthian columns with lots of nice ornamentation on them. That's because the West End was posh. So he was literally, if you knew the code, if you like, he was literally building into the fabric of these churches the economics of the area. So these different styles of column, if you knew the coding behind it, if you knew the language behind it, would tell you what kind of area this was. He was building in to the fabric of the churches, the relative wealth or poverty of the different parishes they were in. The church he built in the middle of the city of London, he based on the Temple of Solomon as described in the Bible. That's a very, very beautiful and ornate church. The churches he built in the East End were much more robust, much less decorous, much more about herding the, getting the plebs in, telling them, reading them the riot act, if you like, getting them to conform to good Christian morality.
And so the whole point is control, is that to keep people who in the lower end like feeling like fear God, be a good person kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, the part of the sort of design brief was to make these churches solemn and awful, make them imposing, make them so they look like God meant business. And if you look at these churches, some of the walls on these churches are like a meter thick. There's absolutely no structural reason to build something that robust. They look like castles, plonked in the middle of town. These huge, formidable buildings were there deliberately to intimidate the locals.
We see that same thing, don't we, today? Even, with government buildings, things like that, you find that they'll just be disgusting concrete towers with barely any windows on them. And it's just because it's imposing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, a fun fact is that, St. Paul's Cathedral, Christopher Wren deliberately designed that to make you feel dizzy. It's an architectural effect called the trompe d'oeil, the triumph of the eye or something like that. It's in French. But when you look up at the roof of St. Paul's and then you see the dome, it draws the eye up, and it was deliberately designed to make you feel kind of a bit dizzy, a bit intimidated, and feel the power of God. The buildings were deliberately designed to intimidate.
You wouldn't believe so much goes into the architecture. You'd think it was more about, what looks nice, but someone sat there going, what's going to make them feel terrified?
Yes. Yeah, Christopher Wren was keen to let people know that God was watching them. Like his dad and his uncle were both very, very senior clergy, bishops, and they were very, very much into the idea that you owed the king obedience in the same way you owed God obedience, absolute obedience. You have no rights whatsoever. You just do what you're told because that's the way creation was made. Christopher Wren's cousin wrote something that said, he was very anti-democratic. And he said, look, if you go back to the Bible, the people of Israel did not get a vote on the 10 commandments. God imposed the 10 commandments. That's the way the world works. The people of Israel, God is not a democratic entity. The people of Israel were told by Moses they didn't get a vote on it. So that's how it should be now. That was Nicholas Wren, Christopher's cousin.
And so there's also a bigger shape to this, isn't there, to the placement of the churches, which goes beyond, the design of the churches themselves, the actual placement. What's that about?
Well, this is really the what I try and flesh out in the book. There are different people have different interpretations. My interpretation of why Hawksmoor did this is pretty convoluted, but it involves his Freemasonry, because he was obviously a Freemason. And it involves kind of one of the stories that it seems Freemasons like. I'm going to say, I don't know quite how to put it, but the story of Isis and Osiris is a very, very old Egyptian story. A lot of people say, for good reason, it's got a lot of elements that seem to foreshadow the story of Jesus. The figure of Horus in this story, I'm sure most people know. Born on December 25th of a virgin birth, he fought evil, and he was eventually restored when he defeated his evil uncle Seth. But in that story, there's the one thread of that story is the part about the eye of Horus, and Horus losing his eye, and the god Thoth putting the eye back together again and putting it back in Horus's face so he could defeat his evil uncle. For whatever reason, the priesthood of Thoth, who was the god of wisdom and letters, was something that the Freemasons really identified with. They considered themselves, or at least some of them did anyway, to be like the priesthood of Thoth, i.e. the people who put the eye of Horus back together and helped defeat the forces of chaos. My take on this alludes to that. Do you want? I'm kind of reticent to say exactly what it says in the book because it always sounds so preposterous. From my point of view, it seems he was making almost like a riddle or a puzzle that wouldn't be without precedent in Freemasonry. The placement of the churches. If you'd sat on Greenwich Hill in the southeast of London, looked out, you'd have been able to see them all. And it's kind of like a dot to dot. He was making a dot to dot of the Eye of Horus, which is one of the principal symbols of Freemasonry.
That's incredible. I mean, when I saw that, I found it just like, whoa, but it makes sense, like you say. The Freemasonry, the connection to Horus, that I love all the connections to the solar mythology behind it all, especially because that's what it all boils down to. Most people will get offended by that, but Christianity is essentially just a mishmash of others, but it's focused solely on Egyptian, and definitely comes from that Horus element.
Yes.
Like you say, born to the Virgin, we all see Virgin in the sky as Virgo. I don't know if you've ever heard of all that stuff like Bethlehem. You've read Alan Wilson's books, haven't you? So you've seen like Bethlehem, meaning like house of bread meaning Virgo.
Yeah.
Even the original Jewish New Year, Tishri 1, is it's bang in the middle of September usually, but it's the beginning of the new year. That's how they saw it. So you can see it, can't you? A new son being born to the Virgin is basically just saying, the new year has been born. We've just had our harvest in August, and now there's a new sun passing through the Virgin, and this is a new year. So it's a new sun in a new year, and that's just the cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think someone brought to my attention years ago that Jesus' birthday is literally the perfect day for a solar king or solar deity to be born on, because it's it's just when the sun starts rising up in the sky again. I mean, the whole Isis and Osiris story being at least 1,500, 2,000 years older than the story of Christ, and having all those similarities. Anyone who wants to say that's a coincidence is
well, you've also got Mithras as well, haven't you? Mithras is connected to that date, as well as I think Sol Invictus.
Yeah, I mean, it was a good day. It's astronomically very, very solid day. You always know when that day is because the sun's a bit higher.
Well, it's the day that light finally overcomes the darkness, but it hasn't won the battle yet. It doesn't win the battle until this spring equinox, when day finally overtakes nighttime and it becomes the dominant force for 6 months. When you learn it all, it suddenly starts to make sense, doesn't it? And you realize, like, oh, okay, they were just trying to tell me through like a story,
Yeah, I mean, it makes more sense to me than the creator of the universe, created the earth, and then because he had a problem with us eating fruit, cursed us all to eternity because of a talking snake, and then I mean, none of it makes sense, does it? I mean, I should say one thing that happened during Hawksmoor's time that was sort of certainly shook a lot of people was a translation of the work of Josephus, the Roman historian. Now, if you read any copy of Josephus's history from the Middle Ages, it says Jesus did this, Jesus did that, Jesus did the other, because people wrote it wrote in these bits about Jesus. When they did the translation of the original, the oldest copy they could find of Josephus doesn't mention Jesus, the Son of God of Nazareth, and all of that once. And that means that the best historian who was around and writing about the time Jesus was supposed to be there doesn't mention him once, which made Hawksmoor and so on very, very skeptical about the existence of Jesus as an historical figure, which I think is justified, because there isn't anyone who talks about Jesus until long after he died, in whatever you want to say, 30 odd AD. No one mentions him till about 40 or 50 years later. There were hundreds of people writing at the time who would write down anything, if there was a comet, people would mention that. If there was a bad harvest, people would mention that. But they don't mention this guy walking around preaching peace.
I believe as well in the records, it's somewhere around 70 AD. One of the Roman generals has gone to Jerusalem and caused some havoc there. Yes. And one of the Jewish kings said, "Oh, you are the Messiah that was proclaimed."
No, that person who said, "Yeah, you are the Messiah," that was Josephus. He had been the leader of the Israeli army in the north. The Romans had just killed them all. And Josephus, saw the general, but would soon be the emperor Vespasian, and saw him and said, "You know what? You know who you are? You're the Messiah, as prophesied by our holy books. You're the fucking man, right?" And Vespasian went, "Oh, come with me." And so Vespasian ended up taking this guy Josephus home to Rome, and it was Josephus who ended up writing an awful lot of the history of the era.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
It was the Flavian family. Vespasian became emperor after Nero, and his family, the Flavian family, took over. They became the imperial family. It was that family that produced all the first bishops, built the first churches. That family were well into Christianity long before most people had even heard of it.
I don't know how much of Alan Wilson's stuff on the original Christianity you follow, with the whole, Caradoc gone to Rome, first son, Linus, first bishop of Rome, being the son of Caradoc, stuff like that.
I find the fact that there was a British Christianity very, very, very early, like, that's compelling. That's obviously happened. I'm not clear that Caradoc converted the Romans. I don't know about that. What I do know is that the Flavian family built all the first churches, were all the first bishops, and did control the Roman Catholic Church, not the British Apostolic Church, but the Roman Catholic Church was very much a creation of the Flavian family.